If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Nurses and doctors, what's your weirdest/scariest paranormal stories that took place during work? I've worked in a small family-run nursing home for 6 years as a nurse aide. It was an orphanage before it became a nursing home, and unfortunately before being shut down the orphanage had a history of severe abuse and neglect. Unfortunately, it's not gossip, the owner herself has told us. When residents get close to death, they always see a little girl. One of my patients, a very alert gentleman, he knew all our names and was very alert and oriented. I was passing dinner trays and saw that he had his back turned and was talking and laughing in the corner. I knocked and asked him who he was talking to, and he chuckled and said, "This little girl came into my room. She was scared." He died 3 days later. About 6 months later, had another patient screaming about a little girl grabbing his feet and she needed to leave him alone. He died that night. She's come up over the years, it's always the same thing, they see her and then they die. Other coworkers have had the same experience. It's very unsettling. I'm a psychiatric nurse. Early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. There was a resident I'll call Marion Duchesne. He was an elective mute, which simply means that he couldn't talk, but there were no pathological findings as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the notable exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19. After boot camp, he was stationed somewhere in the South. One night, he just vanished. It was declared an AWOL for years, and finally he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Duchesne and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess via fingerprints. He was well fed and in good health, except for his refusal to speak. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man and that whomever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They said he was a haint and a stand-in for their dead relative and demanded not to be contacted again." Marion paced all day every day. Not in a frantic way, but just lumbering up and down the halls and outside. He smiled all the time and would be moving his mouth in a way that indicated talking or muttering, but he was dead silent. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If told to go to the dining room for a meal, he'd go and eat. But if nobody told him, he just kept pacing, never indicating hunger. If offered a cigarette, he'd smoke it in an oddly formal way, almost delicately, if that makes sense. But he never seemed to crave smoking. The man wanted nothing. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. There was nothing to do for this man. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, on my way to something better, the last thing I saw was Marion, pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. I worked in a pediatric hospital and had always heard that the 4th floor right outside our oncology unit was haunted. I worked 3/12s normally but would pick up overtime and picked up a night shift. I was working in the NICU, which happened to also be on the 4th floor but on the opposite side. The oncology unit had a staircase that was a shortcut down to the cafeteria, which was on the 2nd floor. At about 3 a.m. I was ready to take a short break and wanted a cup of coffee from the cafeteria, so I decided to take that staircase. I walked through the automatic double doors and saw a kid skipping down the hall. I called out to him as I was afraid a little kid had snuck out of a patient room. As soon as I called out to him, he turned and in the blink of an eye totally vanished. A lot of other nurses and docs had seen the same little kid skipping in that same hallway. Of course I chalked it up to just exhaustion and didn't really think about it much after that. But you are damn sure I didn't use that hallway at night ever again. I'm a nurse. I've witnessed quite a lot with Alzheimer people. They often develop their own scenarios in their own head, often accompanied by vivid hallucinations. Once during night shift, I heard a woman scream in fear. Checking on her, she managed to climb into her wheelchair in pure panic, wanting to flee her bedroom. Asking what was wrong, she thought the building was on fire. Now what's important to mention here is, people often make claims that people are just crazy or dreaming badly or something. But this is not the case. People with hallucinations have been found to actually see, hear, smell, etc. something, when their hallucinations occur, as the same locations in the brain are stimulated as if they would get real impulses. That woman actually saw fire. She actually smelled fire. She didn't just make that up to be crazy. It's what her brain told her was happening. And she was in real panic for her life. And the same applies to when those people see someone else in their room. When they want me to guide someone out of the bedroom who isn't actually there, seemingly standing right behind me. And it makes no sense to discuss with them that no one's there. To them, someone is there. And you better do your best effort of improvising to guide that someone, even if it's no one, outside. Play along, and they'll be fine. This, to me, is the scariest thing at work. They see something you don't. Worked in a nursing home/long-term facility for multiple years. Personally hadn't experienced anything too crazy apart from mystery call lights call bell system going off, no buttons lit up, no rooms lit up, system would have to be reset from the electrical room to clear it. Hearing doors close shut, toilets flushing, faucets running. These were by no means commonplace. Other staff had some more direct experiences though. Apparently in one hall a little girl would occasionally be seen walking. This had been reported by multiple staff as well as patients. A staff member was sitting out in her car during night shift when some woman who knocked on her window and quickly disappeared. The next day she was discussing this out loud with the oncoming shift when someone pulled out a picture from old files based on the description provided. Apparently, it was a match to a former patient that had passed away at least 10 years before that staff member was hired. I worked as a med tech at an assisted living facility. One day a resident, I'll call her Margaret, suddenly passed away and her family left all her belongings in the room that night including her pendant to call the staff for help. The next night Margaret's neighbor called the staff because someone was talking in the room next door and keeping them awake. We brushed the resident off knowing that Margaret's room was empty. About an hour later Margaret's pendant started going off from her empty apartment. I was the only one willing to go turn it off, so I walked into the room and it was freezing cold in the middle of summer, the air conditioning was off. Suddenly the bathroom door slammed as I was turning off the pendant light. I locked the door and ran back to the nurse's station. We forced one of the older male staff members to go check out the entire room and he claims the door was still locked when he got down there and no one was in there. Growing up, my maternal grandmother and I were always pretty sensitive to paranormal stuff, but my mother was not. She thought her mom was a crock, and she was sure I was making stuff up. Just as a preface. So while mom was in nursing school, she worked as a home health aide. She got a pretty cushy gig working with this disabled woman named Mary. I was too young to know what was wrong with Mary, but looking back now, I would guess she was someone who was mentally 5 though she was in her 50s. Mary's parents had provided well for her, left her with her own giant, beautiful home fully equipped for a handicapped person, enough money and a fund to finance care, etc. So mom was one of only 4 staff to work with Mary, because she did not like new people, 2 midnighters and 2-day staff. She received around-the-clock care, but mom was able to bring Mary home with her, so we spent a lot of time with Mary as a family. Mary was sweet and very kind. I actually have an old photo of me, her and mom when I was dressed for one of my dance parades. We all loved her to death. One morning, on a day mom was off work but had school, she got up in a rush and ran downstairs. I thought she was late to school, so I went down with her to help her get what she needed to leave. But she was on the phone, dialing people who were not answering her. I will never ever forget this. Mom was shaking and crying, blubbering to herself without making any real sense. She finally slammed the phone down on the table and put her hands on her face, and I asked her what was wrong. She told me she had woke up to Mary at her bedside patting her hand the way she did when she was very pleased with something mom did, but when she sat up in bed Mary was gone. The phone rang, and it was the nurse at the house. Mary had passed away the night before. She came to tell mom goodbye. She still never believed in the paranormal, but she did quit nursing school and never worked in home health again. She never said, but I got the sense she couldn't handle another Mary happening to her again. My mom was pretty stoic, but that broke her. I am a psychiatrist, and during my training years I worked for 6 months at a ward treating patients with depressive and anxiety disorders. It was an old building who had been housing psychiatric patients since the mid-1920s. On our floor we had 13 beds and a nursing station, a living room, and a few conference rooms. One day a few weeks in I am interviewing a patient who when asked about sleeping patterns tells me, she have heard a baby crying at night waking her up. There are no babies in that hospital as the place is situated far away from housing areas and there were restricted visiting hours. Afterwards the nurse pulls me aside and tells me, That the baby crying thing is not a psychotic symptom. She is very serious about this, but won't elaborate. I kind of shrug it off, as either way it does not change the diagnostic or treatment, and forgets about the experience. Around 3 months in my stay I sit in the nurse's station and 3 nurses behind me are talking. One of them says she is very active today and the other says really? Oh, noticed. I turn around and ask them who they are talking about. They look at each other, and then one of them hesitantly says well, there is a baby here. She cries sometimes. I of course says no, but they just kind of shrug and smiles. Not 30 seconds later I hear it. It sounded far away but not too far. A cry, clearly a baby's cry, sounding like it is separated from us by maybe 2 or 3 walls. I am perplexed and look at the nurses. They look at me like told you so. I of course ask about this, but they can't say anything else but this faint baby cry is there and have been there always. Since then I heard it maybe 2 to 3 times a week. I told a new doctor about it who laughed. However, a few weeks in her stay she came to me, white as a sheet, and told me she heard it in their coffee break. All the nurses just kind of knew about it, and being in psychiatry, hearing that kind of stuff is not really something you brag about. I was transferred and haven't heard it since. I think about it sometimes, but I don't really know what to make of it. I was at work after the dinner rush. I knew the story of the man in the tall black hat, I'd just never seen him personally. I was reporting to a nurse about my recommendation for a diet and swallowing precautions I wanted a patient who was nearing their end of their life. We were discussing how the patient wouldn't likely make it more than a few days and had already been chattering to me about the small kids at the end of the bed and the tall man. I was facing the nurse with my back to the hallway I had just come from and she was looking over my shoulder. I felt a tap on my shoulder and a glimpse of darkness out of the corner of my eye. The nurse just grinned at me as I whipped around where I saw only an empty hallway. She said, "You just saw him too, didn't you?" The patient passed 12 hours later. I gotta be honest. It's not the tall man with the hat that freaks me out. Not the kids. Not the fact that the 100-year-old patients tend to congregate around the room of the next upcoming one to pass. Those are all informative and help me know when to call family in. The thing that freaks me out so much is the fact that they all see the same damn thing. Regardless of their health, reason of passing, illness, whatever, if their march toward the end of life is slow enough to see it in stages, they all talk about the same things that they see. Family members long past calling out to them, the small kids standing unobtrusive at the edge of the room, in broad daylight mind you, and the tall man with a hat. It's so consistent you can almost set a clock by it. Ask any nurse. They are made of steel and iron, but they all know the signs the other patients give off when someone is about to pass. My auntie used to work as a nurse on a palliative care ward in a hospital. She always used to tell us this story about several strange things that used to happen when she worked night shifts. She worked the night shift with 2 other nurses on the left wing of the ward. The wing was made up of 2 sections with 8 beds in each. They had 8 patients in room 1 that evening. The nurses had looked after one particular gentleman for a while. He didn't often get many visitors as his wife had died years earlier, and he'd lost touch with his daughter, so they quite often kept him company. He always used to ask the nurse to leave a light on by his bed so he could read if he couldn't get to sleep, or for the TV to be left on low. Apparently he liked the voices in the background and it comforted him knowing someone was there. For these reasons, they moved him into the empty room 2 when they came into work around 9 p.m. so the noise/light wouldn't bother the other patients. This became a little routine when second room was empty. My auntie and the 2 nurses started their shift as usual one evening, and sadly discovered that the gentleman had passed away earlier that afternoon. Room 2 was now empty again, with the 7 other patients in room 1. It was 11 p.m.-ish, all the patients were asleep and the only lights on were those illuminating the office section where the nurses were sat, along with computer monitors, and the ceiling lights at the end of the hallway leading to the next wing. They were taking their break, having a coffee and chatting when one of them suddenly stopped talking and held her hand up. They listened, and could hear someone talking nearby. At first they assumed it was someone from the next wing walking past, but the talking remained a few minutes later. My auntie looked round the corner to see if there was anyone there, no one. She turned back around to go towards the desk and saw a light shimmering in room 2. She called the other nurses and they went into the room. The bedside light was on, and the TV was on in the bay where the gentleman used to sleep. Auntie said they got the shivers, but it made them feel slightly emotional. However, they switched off the light and TV and went back to the desk. This apparently happened on 7 other occasions over the following weeks, even when other nurses were working. Same light, same TV, always around 11 p.m. What my auntie said was so comforting, as she believed he enjoyed chatting with them and appreciated the extra effort they did to move him so he could watch the TV after hours, so he came back to see them again for their little ritual. The wards later filled up and room 2 was being used more and more, so was rarely left unoccupied. One patient mentioned a light turning on and waking him up around midnight once, but he couldn't recall which one as he went back to sleep. The legend lives on, and is explained to new staff who work there. Everyone on the ward to this day knows of the gentleman who likes to watch TV late at night, and they are told that if the room is empty, to make sure the volume isn't high and to let him watch like he used to. When I was in a rural practice, late at night, I was checking a patient inside the office with closed door, naturally. All of a sudden I heard a thump sound from outside where the nurse's desk was, which was about 5 feet from my door. Nothing strange really, because the outside door was open for ventilation purposes. We were 32 degrees Celsius, and maybe someone passed on the road or something. Whatever. Next day, a surveyor for another government agency stopped by and we chatted for a couple of minutes. I see you work a lot here. We passed by last night and we saw the door open and a person sitting by the desk. I froze, because at no point during the night there was someone sitting there. Maybe you mistook the file cabinet, or whatever. I was trying to make sense of it. No. It was right here, and when we passed, that door, the office one, was closed. We thought you were with a patient and another was waiting. Creeped out as I was, I dismissed it. That night, after turning everything off, went to my room to sleep. We have to stay at our practices during social services. We practically live there, and for the first half of the night I heard thumping outside and chairs moving slightly. I had to stay there for another 6 months. Oh shit, I got one. In med school, we had an anatomy exam on like November 1st or 2nd. So on Halloween night, me and my roommate decided that since everyone else was off partying, this would be a good time to get some uninterrupted studying going. Well, it was already creepy as hell being in the basement of the med school surrounded by cadavers. Well, an hour or so in, we're going through anatomy and all of a sudden on the other side of the lab a faucet suddenly turns on. These faucets are the ones that have motion sensors on them, and we're all the way on the other side of the lab. We were a bit creeped out, but dismissed it. We get back to work and then it happens again, but on a different side of the room, again far from where we are. This happens maybe 2 more times over the course of an hour or so. Finally we've had enough and we decide to leave. As we're gathering our stuff and heading out, we remark to each other about a side room where the instructors will prep their lectures and for exams etc. We decide to pop our head in to see what was in there and we stop dead in our tracks. Like I said, we were the only ones in the lab and we had heard no one else come in. In the side room there is some person that we don't really recognize bent over, working on a cadaver. Their back is to the door and me and my friend were being plenty loud, but yet they remain hunched over working on the dead body. We have no idea who this strange person is, and we've had it now. We slowly back out and get out of there. When I worked in the hospital, I picked up a swing shift that ended up going long, so was there until 2 a.m. I had a patient that was troubled all day talking about dying and writing illegible things on scraps of paper. Later in the evening she was super calm and told me she was going to die. I talked her same as before, but this time she said, "No, I'm going to die." I walked out of her room, but about 10 minutes later I had this feeling I needed to go back. I found her unresponsive with an incredibly weak pulse. I called a code. She was generally healthy and in her early 60s. After CPR she was stabilized and moved to ICU. My shift ended another 6 hours later. When I was leaving, the halls were empty, lights were dimmed, and everything was an eerie quiet. I had almost reached the exit door when I looked to my left up past the one-way glass, but there was a light behind it so you could see through. When I looked up I saw that patient standing there giving me this shit-eating grin. That room was locked for the evening so there was no way someone could get in there. I thought I imagined it, maybe something was there and my mind made it up. When I went in the next day and everything was bustling again, I looked where I had seen her face and there was absolutely nothing there that could even be mistaken. It was a blank wall. This happened on Friday 4/10/2020. I work at a doctor's office and we always joke around with how the place is haunted cause someone died there and I'm normally the early guy on Mondays, Thursdays, and Fridays. All the lights are supposed to be turned on by me in the morning, that go through main hallways and the front desk area. What's not supposed to be on is the doctor's area's lights or the lights for the lab. Now I and one other person normally have the early shift 6:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. I normally get there at around 6:15. Well, I got there early and half the lights were on. I turn off the doctor's area lights and the lab lights and continue on knowing that I am the first person in the clinic. We do not have sensors for lights or anything, my coworker comes in through the back, same way I did, and says all the lights that I turned off were turned on again. We check the cameras and the cameras are rather high quality and do see some of the light switches depending on what camera are looking through. We see the switches flip. And come to find out that when I got to the front desk, our manager's door is halfway open. I never seen anybody else's car and I know our manager was out for Friday and I know for certain I was the only person in the office, because I had to turn off the alarm. I know my coworkers to close all doors and turn off all lights. CNA here, I've worked home health and nursing homes. The scariest thing was one of my clients with dementia. I grew so close with the family. The client would make comments that his wife needed to get new wallpaper because it was covered with spiders and he always seen spiders dancing on her head. I would spend casual respite time, i.e. playing games or watching TV with the couple, socializing with their family as they would come and go from the house. Well, one family member was telling us about a dream he had. He didn't know who this man was in his dream, never seen him in his life. He just knew that this person was trying to harm him and he had to kill him before this man could do anything. He felt so close to this person, like he had knew him his whole life but he didn't know who he was. Always in his dream he seen him walking up and down the road or around town and he would stare at him as he drove by. Sometimes he would make the conscious effort to stop and help him but this man would attack him. Hearing all this, I was shook and immediately had it pieced together. I excused myself to cry the hardest cry since I lost my own mother years prior. I told him in confidence that this man he is seeing is death. But he's in the form of his great-grandfather. Death is coming for his great-grandfather and you feel the need to kill death before he touches your pop. The entire family later confirmed the angel of death when they're the only visitors in the house late in the evening, makes his appearance. You only see a face for a split second and then it's gone. It's one of the most unnerving things I've experienced. Working for the last 3 years in an old community hospital has made for an abundance of strange happenings. Especially in the older wings that are no longer used. Our old, retired CCU was because it's currently being used as a quarantine unit for C-19, notorious for telemetry monitors and call lights turning on without cause during the night. I've witnessed people walking in and out of rooms in our old observation unit when going up to scavenge for 4 pumps and the likes. Creepiest thing, though? One I'll probably never forget, helped give an old, demented woman a bed bath one night. She was very much alive and very much talking/complaining to us through the whole thing. 10 minutes later, we hear her scream down the hall, "Help! Help me! I'm dying!" We got to the room and found her completely pulseless and apneic. Eyes and mouth hanging open like she had witnessed something horrific just before she passed. It still creeps me out to be honest. Working in an ER, I've witnessed a lot of death. But, man, that one got to me. Makes me wonder what she saw just before she died. Years ago I had a second job as a security guard. One of our sites was a building that had started out as a hospital. The city and hospital worked out a deal, new hospital building in another part of town. City gets the old building. City used the old building as a school, then offices, and it was sitting idle at the time waiting for another remod. Even when it was a hospital there were stories about people hearing babies crying when no babies were there. When it became an office building the stories were just folklore. How could you tell whether someone had an upset baby on another floor or not? We weren't the first company to patrol the site. We ended up losing the contract for the same reason, we couldn't keep a guard on the site. Most would work a week or so, then refuse to go back. Push come to shove they would quit. Minimum wage only fights the willies so long. Most complained about having to chase noises all night. Hearing things that might be someone on another floor of the building. After a while just giving up on the upper floors and watching the halls on the first floor. But a few also mentioned hearing babies crying on the third floor. All the way up to opening the stairway door on the third floor, then finding nothing. I never worked the site, I was committed to a site that required some site-specific training, so we were always short-handed there. The owner of the company covered a couple of shifts early on, then he refused to go back. Pretty sure I would have walked before I went. Former CMA. I worked at a nursing home, night shift. I had a coworker who said she was a Wiccan. Not too far-fetched, but she also claimed to see demons in our nursing home. I didn't believe that, but there had already been a few freaky things happen in our center. Knocking on the door, setting off the outdoor motion detectors with no one on the camera monitor. That kind of thing. I'm still not sure ghosts are real, but whenever I think back to this experience I'm in disbelief about what actually happened. I was on duty alone one night in our Alzheimer's unit. I started hearing some footsteps, and the electric sound of a room door opening. They were all handicap accessible. Our nurses' station was a semicircle completely windowed, so I could look around pretty easily and see about half of the residents' rooms and the living room. No one was there, so I went out and individually checked on each resident to see if they got up out of bed. No one did. I went back to my station. I started hearing it again, and it was starting to seriously freak me out. I checked on the residents one more time before video calling my friend from Australia. I was almost in tears because the sound was so clear. I started hearing children's music faintly. It was like a horror movie. Then I looked to my left and saw one of the residents staring at me through the window. It clearly scared the daylights out of me. She looked angry. She pounded her hand on the glass. I hung up the call and went out to help her. Now this resident is a stroke survivor. You could usually get a general idea of what she wanted, but she was muttering angrily pure gibberish. I asked her questions trying to see what she needed, but she just got more frustrated. I brought her to her room, gave her medication, because it was right around time for it anyways, and she went to sleep. She would die from another stroke in 2 days. I start cleaning the building. The spa room for some reason always gave me the creeps. This time, I could not clean it at all. The spa room is in a sort of uppercase I shape. The front area is where you get the supplies, residents can undress, etc. There's a small hall with a shower to your right and a hot tub to your left. The end has a bathroom. In the left corner is always a chair. This night, the chair was in the middle of the hall facing the door. There was no reason for it to be there. If a CMA was helping a resident into the bath, it would have been further back, as that location has no range of motion. If it was to help a resident get undressed, it would be further up. I noped out of there, and here's the kicker. Some backstory: one of our Alzheimer's residents was living with her non-Alzheimer's husband in the same room. She often forgot who he was, and it was very sad. The week before this, he tragically died in the hospital. The next shift, I was on a evening-night double shift. The morning shift girl told me something strange. She said that about 30 minutes after I left, the woman ran out of her room screaming. She told her there's a man at the end of my bed saying he's dead. This is a story that was told to me by a nurse who worked in a nursing home in a small Texas town. Now, in this nursing home there were 2 wings which were connected by a hallway. Compared to the front wing, the back was always a bit heavy with gloom, maybe even spooky at times. Not sure how to explain it, but there was certainly a darker atmosphere. For this reason, the nurses disliked staying in the back, so after the residents were in bed, and the night's last rounds were completed, they would migrate to the front nurses' station. This nightly trek went on for a while, until the administration learned of it, and for liability reasons, instructed the back wing nurses to stay in their assigned place of duty. There were always ghostly happenings. Nonetheless, these incidents were mostly shrugged off as the imagination of tired and overworked employees. But there was one incident in particular that was quite terrifying and witnessed by several people. One resident, Mr. Gomez, was rumored to have been into brujeria throughout his life. Late at night, Mr. Gomez, according to reports from other residents, would creep into their rooms. Like a serpent born of hell, he would slither on his stomach, his arms at his sides. His eyes would be rolled back in his head, his tongue darting in and out of his mouth, flicking the air like a human snake. He would crawl under their beds and try to push them off. He's the devil, the other residents would claim. Well, the reports weren't taken very seriously. After all, these old folks were half out of their minds, and realistically, how could feeble old Mr. Gomez, who needed the assistance of nurses just to get out of bed, be physically capable of such actions? The nurses all agreed that the reports were just imagined stories of old confused people. That is, until the terrifying night that the nurses all became believers of the evil that lived within Mr. Gomez. It was well past midnight, the residents were sleeping, and the halls were quiet. The nurses had gathered in the back lobby to sit and wait for morning. Most of them were at the point of dozing off when a loud gasp broke the silence. One of the nurses stood up, a frightful expression upon her face. She pointed down the hall towards the residents' rooms. As the others turned to look, a horrifying scene unfolded. It was Mr. Gomez, slithering on his stomach, making his way down the hall and into the room of a slumbering woman. They just stood there, petrified, unsure of what to do. Mr. Gomez was now crawling through the hallway, heading right towards the lobby and the fear-struck nurses. The stories were true. Mr. Gomez was slithering like a snake, his eyes rolled back, and his tongue flicking in and out like a cursed beast. They watched as he snaked through the lobby furniture, crawling between chair legs and hissing at the shocked women. The nurses all ran up the hallway to the front desk. The doors to the back wing slammed shut as the last one passed through. They stayed up front for the next few hours. And as the sun began to peek over the horizon, they gathered enough courage to go check on the back wing. Everything was quiet, and Mr. Gomez was once again sleeping in his bed. A few nights later, Mr. Gomez passed away. As the nurses were attending to his body, several loud thumps were heard against the window. They pulled open the drapes to see what could have made the noise. And just as they did, a lechuza flew at the window, clawing at the pane as if trying to get in. The bird then flew into a nearby tree and landed among several other lechuzas perched high in the branches. The birds just stared down at the room where Mr. Gomez lay dead, waiting to claim his soul. In May 2000, I started my nurse training and moved into an old hospital building that was formerly used as the morgue. I didn't know this until I moved out. The building was really creepy and we all joked it was something out of The Shining. It had long dark corridors, cold spots, and a constant feeling you were being watched. Despite the creepy feeling, I never experienced anything spooky for a while, mainly because I was working or socializing so much. 6 months and I was having trouble sleeping one night because my room was so hot. I finally got to sleep but woke up about 2 a.m. because I felt icy cold. I covered myself up but had a terrible feeling of dread. I tried to push the sensation away, but after a minute, I felt like I was being held down by something ice cold. I was terrified but was too scared to look. The sensation of being held down lasted a minute and went away. The room suddenly became really hot again and the feeling of dread disappeared. After a few minutes the sensation came back even stronger and I was pinned down again by something icy cold. When it lifted, I ran out of bed and switched the light on, which stayed on for rest of the night. Nothing happened in that room again. I actually moved dorms after this and nothing happened for a while. Sadly, I was asked to go back to the east side of the building while building work was carried out in my dorm. I subsequently experienced worse things, mainly knocking and scratching sounds in the early hours, the feeling of something jumping off my bed and also waking up to something scratching my back. I confided in my other housemates who were equally terrified and experiencing similar things. A few people even reported waking up to see a young girl in their rooms. We all got so worked up that we all slept in the same room for months. I eventually left to complete my final placement and was so relieved to see the back of that place. I'm a RN from Norway. And there's this strange thing that happens that seemingly everyone working at nursery homes/hospitals are aware of. And that is, whenever someone dies, they always die 3 at once. Always 3. Not 2, but 3. It is the strangest thing. I was talking to a midwife once about it and she confirmed that this has happened to her too. She said during a night shift she helped a woman who had miscarried, 1 baby had passed away in the belly before birth, and 1 baby died unexpectedly after delivery. Mind you, this rarely happens. When I was a nursing student, I was able to witness the passing of one of our patients in a nursing home facility. It had been several months, at least 8 months since last someone died at the facility. At that point I had heard the rumors about dying in 3s, but everyone in the facility was so healthy that I couldn't imagine anyone just dropping dead. "Just wait, there'll be more," one of the elder nurses said as I went home after my shift. Sure enough, the next morning a patient had unexpectedly died in her sleep. On the 3rd day, another resident had a major stroke and died in the living room at night.